It began with a wind that should not have been there. The old forest had its own winds, the breath of the withywindle stirring the willows, the damp gusts that carried the smell of moss and slow water. But this wind was different. It came from the west, from beyond the sea, and it carried a scent Tom Bombadil had not smelled since before the first acorn split its shell and reached for the sky. Manwë was calling. Tom stood at the edge of his garden, bare feet in the mud, and tilted his head like a bird listening to something far away. Goldberry came to the door, her hair bright with river light, and she looked at her husband with eyes that had seen the world begin. "They are calling you," she said. Tom nodded slowly. He had known this day would come. He had known it since before there were days to count, before the sun and moon were set in the sky, before the lamps of the Valar cast their first light across the flat earth. He had known, because Tom knew everything that happened in his realm, and his realm was wider than anyone guessed. He put down his gathering basket. He kissed Goldberry on the forehead. And then Tom Bombadil, who had never left his forest in all the ages of the world, began to walk west. The trees bowed as he passed. Not in fear. Trees never feared Tom, but in recognition. The old man willow, oldest and grumpiest of the willows, stirred his roots and whispered something that sounded almost like farewell. The badgers and foxes and fat brown rabbits stopped in their tracks and watched him go, their dark eyes shining with a knowledge animals carry and men have forgotten. Tom walked through the old forest. He walked through the Barrow Downs, where the wights lay silent in their tombs and did not stir, not because they were asleep, but because they felt something pass above them that even the darkness of Angmar could not challenge. He walked through Bree, though no one saw him. He walked through the Shire, where hobbits dozed in their holes, and never knew that the oldest being in Middle-earth had crossed their borders. At the Grey Havens, Córdan the shipwright was waiting. He had been waiting for exactly 7 days. Manwë had sent him a vision, the clearest he had received since the changing of the world. And Córdan, who had stood on these shores since before the sun rose, knew better than to question the elder king. A ship was ready. White timbers, silver sails, a swan prow that caught the starlight even in the dark. Córdan had prepared it himself, and as Tom approached along the quay, the shipwright did something he had done only twice before in all the ages of his life. He bowed. "You do not need to do that," Tom said cheerfully. "I think I do," Córdan replied, and Tom climbed aboard without another word. The ship sailed west, and the straight road opened before it. Part 2. The Straight Road. The straight road is not a path across water. It is a path across the fabric of the world itself, left behind when Ilúvatar bent the seas and removed Valinor from the circles of the earth. Mortal ships cannot find it. Even elven ships must carry the light of Valinor in their timbers to navigate its curves. Tom Bombadil needed none of that. He stood at the prow, his blue coat flapping in a wind that smelled of the first spring, and he hummed. Not an elven hymn or a Valarin chant, just a tune. A simple tune, the kind Goldberry might sing while gathering water-lilies, and the straight road rose to meet it. The voyage took no time at all, or perhaps it took 1,000 years. Time on the straight road does not behave the way time behaves in mortal lands. What is certain is that at the end of it, the ship glided into the Bay of Eldamar, and the white shores of Valinor rose before Tom Bombadil like a dream half-remembered. He stepped onto the sand and looked around. The light here was different, softer than sunlight, richer than starlight, woven from something that predated both. The air tasted of beginnings. The mountains of the Peliri rose in the distance, their peaks lost in clouds that glowed from within. And everywhere there was music, the echo of the great music that had sung the world into being. Vanyar and Maiar and elves who had never known mortality went about their lives in the gardens and halls of Tirion, but they stopped when they saw him. Not because they recognized him, because they could not recognize him. He was not elf, not Maya, not Valar, not anything their long memories could classify. He was simply Tom, and that was the most unnerving thing any of them had ever encountered. Ainur, herald of Manwë and the greatest warrior in all of Arda, met him at the gates of Ilmarin. "The Lord of the Winds awaits," Ainur said. His voice was steady, but his eyes were not. "You are expected at the Ring of Doom." Tom clapped him on the shoulder as if greeting an old friend. "Then let us not keep him waiting," said Tom. "He likes punctuality, I am told. Or was that his brother? I can never remember." Ainur did not answer. He simply turned and led the way. Part 3. The Ring of Doom. Manaxa, the Ring of Doom. It is the holiest place in all of Arda, the circle of judgment where the Valar convene to decide the fates of worlds. The thrones of the powers are arranged in a perfect ring of stone, ancient beyond reckoning, carved not by hands, but by the thought of Ilvatar himself. Here the Valar sat when they judged Melkor. Here they sat when they debated the fate of the elves. Here they sat when they chose to remove Valinor from the circles of the world. And here, now, they sat in silence as Tom Bombadil walked into the circle. All 14 of them were present, the Aratar, the High Ones of Arda, those whom the elves call the gods. Manwë Silimo, Elder King, Lord of the Winds, whose eyes held the blue of the deepest sky and whose voice was the thunder. Varda Elentri, Queen of the Stars, whose face was too bright to look upon directly, and whose presence made the air hum with light. Ulmo, Lord of Waters, whose form shifted like the sea itself, and whose voice was the crash of waves against eternal shores. Owl the Smith, hands still scarred from the creation of the mountains. Yavanna, giver of fruits, whose hair was living vines and whose breath was the scent of every flower that ever bloomed. Nienna, Lady of Mercy, whose eyes were wet with tears that had never stopped falling since the marring of Arda. Orom the Hunter, Tulkas the Strong, Vana the Ever-Young, Nessa the Dancer, Urmo the Dream Master, Est the Healer, Ver the Weaver, Nemo Mandos, Keeper of the Dead, whose face showed nothing and whose mind held the fates of every soul that had ever lived. And Tom Bombadil stood in the centre of them all, his yellow boots bright against the grey stone, boots bright against the grey stone, and smiled. "You wanted to see me," he said. Manwë rose from his throne. He was taller than mountains, more radiant than the sun, and when he spoke, the words seemed to come from everywhere at once. "We have questions, Manwë," and smiled. "You wanted to see me," he said. Manwë rose from his throne. He was taller than mountains, more radiant than the sun, and when he spoke, the words seemed to come from everywhere at once. "We have questions," Manwë said. "You have been in Arda since before we arrived, before the First War, before the lamps." Some of us believe his eyes flickered to Mandos, who remained motionless, that you were here before Arda itself. "We wish to know what you are." Tom tilted his head. "And if I told you that I am exactly what I appear to be, a merry fellow with a blue coat and yellow boots?" "You are not," Manwë replied. "We have watched you. You hold the one ring in your hand and laugh at it. You command the old forest with a song. You speak the language of the earth, of the water, of the fire. No Maya, no Valar, no child of Ilvatar does these things with such ease. You are something else." Silence fell across the Ring of Doom, and in that silence, a strange thing happened. Tom Bombadil stopped smiling. Part 4. The Name. "There is a name," Tom said at last, and the quality of his voice had changed. The cheerfulness was still there, but layered beneath it now was something vast, something that made even the Valar lean forward in their thrones. There is a name I have not spoken since before the music began. I will speak it now if you wish, but you must understand, once it is spoken, it cannot be unheard, even by you. Mandos spoke for the first time. His voice was like stone grinding against stone, and it carried the weight of every doom he had ever pronounced. "Speak it," Mandos said. Tom looked at each of the Valar in turn. His gaze lingered longest on Varda, whose stars he had always loved, on Yavanna, whose trees he had guarded since the first roots split the darkness, on Nienna, whose tears he understood better than she knew. And then he spoke the name. What it was, no record preserves. The chronicles of the Valar fall silent at this moment, not because the scribes stopped writing, but because the name itself could not be written. It was not a word in any language of Arda. It was not a sound that could be produced by any throat that ever breathed. It was the name that existed before names, before language, before the concept of naming had been conceived. It was the name Ilúvatar spoke when he first thought of the world, before the Ainur were called into being, before the timeless halls had form, before anything existed except the One and his thought. The name was the thought, and the thought was the name. When Tom finished speaking, the ring of doom cracked. Not metaphorically. The ancient stone, unbreakable by any force known to the Valar, split down the center with a sound like the breaking of a world. Light poured from the fissure, not the light of the trees, not the light of the sun or moon, but the light that existed before light was separated from darkness, the unlight that is also the source. And the Valar understood. Tom Bombadil was not a Maya who had stayed behind. He was not a Valar who had chosen to forget himself. He was not an avatar of Ilúvatar, for Ilúvatar had no avatars. He was something stranger and simpler and infinitely more terrifying. He was the first thought. When Ilúvatar conceived the world, before he spoke to the Ainur, before he kindled the flame imperishable, he thought a single thought. And that thought, the very first, the seed from which all of Arda would grow, was Tom Bombadil. He was not created, he was not born, he was not made. He simply was, because to be is the nature of the first thought. The Valar were the singers. The Maiar were the harmonies. Arda was the song. But Tom was the idea of the song before anyone thought to sing it. Part 5. The Bowing. Manwë, Elder King, Lord of the Breath of Arda, who had knelt to no one but Ilúvatar himself since the beginning of time, stepped down from his throne. He crossed the cracked stone of the Ring of Doom, and when he reached Tom Bombadil, he did what the elves would later sing about in whispers for 10,000 years. He lowered his head. He bent his knee. He bowed. "You are older than I am," Manwë said. "You are closer to the Father than any of us. I did not know. I should have known." Varda came next. She who kindled the stars, whose beauty made Melkor himself pause in his hatred, knelt beside her husband and bowed her radiant head. The light of Ilmen dimmed around her as if in deference. Then Ulmo, whose voice had shaped the oceans, bowed. Then Aulo, who had shaped the mountains, bowed. Yavanna followed, and Orm and all the rest. Even Tulkas, who had never bowed to anyone, and Mandos, who had proclaimed that the Valar would bow to no one, and Nienna, whose tears fell faster now but were no longer tears of grief. They were tears of recognition. The Valar, the powers of the world, the gods of Arda, knelt before Tom Bombadil in the cracked Ring of Doom, and the light of the undying lands changed colour for the first time in 10,000 years. Tom looked down at them, at Manwë's bowed head, at Varda's dimmed radiance, at Ulmo's shifting form stilled in reverence. And for a moment his face was not the face of a merry fellow in a blue coat. It was the face of something older than joy, older than sorrow, older than the categories into which living minds sort experience. And then he laughed. "Oh, get up, he said, and his voice was Tom Bombadil's voice again, light and careless and full of nonsense. "You will ruin your robes on this stone." "It is very old stone, you know. I remember when it was made." Manwë raised his head, and there was something in his eyes that had never been there before, something that looked almost like hope. "What do you want of us, firstborn of thought?" he asked. Tom considered the question with the gravity it deserved. Then he answered, "Nothing. I have never wanted anything from you. I did not come when you sang the world. I did not help you shape the mountains or fill the seas. I did not fight Melkor. I did none of these things, because none of these things were my task." "Then what is your task?" Varda asked. Tom smiled the smile of someone explaining something very simple to someone who had made it very complicated. "To be," he said. "To watch the water run and the trees grow. To guard the small things, the badgers, the foxes, the little rivers that have no names. The world does not need another power, Lady of Stars. It has enough of those. It needs someone to remember the first raindrop, the first acorn, the first breath of the first creature that crawled out of the sea. Someone has to remember, or the world forgets what it is." And he turned and walked out of the Ring of Doom, leaving the Valar on their knees. Part 6. The Walk Back. Tom did not linger in Valinor. He had seen the two trees once, long ago, and he remembered their light. The memory was enough. He walked back through Tirion, past the silent elves and the baffled Maiar, back to the white ship at the Bay of Eldamar. Ainur escorted him in silence, and this time the herald of Manwë did not hide his awe. "Will you tell them?" Ainur asked as Tom climbed aboard the ship. "The elves, the men, the dwarves. Will you tell them what you are?" Tom shook his head. "They have their own names for me. Old Tom, the Master of the Wood, the Eldest. These are good names, better than the one I spoke today. Names should fit like boots, and those fit well enough." Ainur watched the ship depart, and as it sailed east along the straight road, he thought he heard Tom singing. It was the same tune Tom had sung on the way out, the simple water-lily song, and somehow it echoed across all of Valinor, reaching even into the timeless halls where Ilvatar dwells. And Ilvatar, who never speaks and never moves and never changes, smiled. Part 7. The Return. Tom came home to the old forest on a Tuesday, or perhaps a Friday. The days had never mattered much to him, and the journey had made them matter even less. Goldberry was waiting at the edge of the garden, just as she had been when he left, and if you had asked her how long he had been gone, she could not have told you. Time does not pass in Tom's house the way it passes elsewhere. "Did they get their answers?" she asked. "They got the ones they needed," Tom replied, "not the ones they wanted." That is usually how it goes. He picked up his gathering basket exactly where he had left it. It had not moved, had not gathered dust, had not been disturbed by any creature of the forest. He resumed his walk along the Withywindle, collecting water-lilies as if nothing had happened, and, in a sense, nothing had. The Valar continued to govern Arda. The sun rose and set. The elves sailed west. The dwarves dug deeper. The men built kingdoms and watched them fall. The War of the Ring came and went, and Tom Bombadil helped an old friend at the Barrow Downs, and then faded from the story, as he always did, as he always would. But something had changed in the deep places of the world. For the first time since the marring, the Valar were not certain they were the highest authority in Arda. They knew now that there was something older, something closer to the source, something that had watched them sing the world into being and had declined to join. And this knowledge humbled them in a way that even the rebellion of Melkor had not. Mandos wrote a new line in the Book of Ages, "And the firstborn of thought walked among us, and we did not know him." Yavanna tended her gardens with a new tenderness, as if every flower now reminded her of someone. And Manwë, when he sent his winds across Middle-earth, sometimes let them linger over the old forest, not to watch, not to judge, but simply to listen to a tune drifting up from the Withywindle, a tune about water-lilies. Part 8. The Last Secret. There is one thing more. Long after the events of the Ring of Doom, long after the Third Age had ended and the Fourth had begun, a ship came to the Grey Havens. Gandalf was on it, and Frodo, and Bilbo, and Galadriel, and Elrond. The last of the ring-bearers, bound for Valinor at the end of all things. As the ship prepared to depart, Círdan told Gandalf what he had seen, not as a warning, as a gift. Something to carry west, to give to the Valar, if the Valar ever asked. "When you see Manwë," Círdan said, "tell him Tom says hello, and tell him the water-lilies are blooming." Gandalf looked at the shipwright with a strange expression, half wonder, half understanding. He had met Tom once, in another age, in another story. He had always known there was more to the Master of the Wood than met the eye. But hearing it confirmed by the shipwright of the Grey Havens on the day of his final voyage was something else entirely. "I will tell him," Gandalf said. And he did. When the white ship reached Valinor, and the ring-bearers were welcomed by the Vanyar, and Gandalf Olrin, as he had been called before time began, stood once more before Manwë in the Ring of Doom, he delivered the message. "Tom says hello, and the water-lilies are blooming." Manwë, Elder King, Lord of the Breath of Arda, did something no one had ever seen him do. He laughed. It was not the laughter of a god, amused by a mortal jest. It was the laughter of someone who had carried a weight for longer than he could remember and had just set it down. It was the laughter of recognition, of relief, of the sudden understanding that the universe was larger and stranger and kinder than even the wisest of the Valar had guessed. "He is still there," Manwë said, half to himself, "after everything. After Melkor, after the marring, after the wars and the sorrows and the bending of the world. He is still there, and the water-lilies are blooming." He turned to Varda, who was already smiling. And Manwë said, "Then perhaps we did something right after all." Part 9. The song continues. In the old forest, the Withywindle runs as it always has, slow and brown and full of secrets. The willows lean over the water, and if you listen closely on the right kind of evening, when the light is golden and the air smells of damp earth, you might hear singing. It is not an elven song. It is not a mortal song. It does not have words that can be written down or a melody that can be remembered. It is simply the sound of the world being glad that it exists. The sound of the first thought still thinking itself into being. The sound of Tom Bombadil tending his garden at the end of all things. The Valar know that sound now. They recognize it for what it is. The foundation on which all their works are built. The whisper beneath the music. The silence that makes the singing possible. And when the world ends, as all worlds must, and the second music is sung, and the Ainur take up their parts once more, something will be different. Because this time, Tom Bombadil will sing too. Not because he must, not because Ilvatar asks it, but because Goldberry will be there, and the badgers and the foxes and the little rivers that have no names. And Tom has never been able to resist a good tune. He will sing the part that has no words, the part that comes before the beginning, the part that was there when Ilvatar first thought of the world, and will be there when the last note of the second music fades into the silence from which all things come and to which all things return. And the Valar, the powers of Arda, the gods of a world that was, will bow once more. Not in awe this time, not in fear, in gratitude.